700 years ago, in the heart of medieval England, canceling someone meant something very different. Today, it might strip away your reputation, maybe your career. Back then, it stripped away your flesh, your dignity, and your life. All in a single day, before the eyes of a roaring crowd. Picture it, the town square, echoing with the sound of boots and jeers. The mob is wild, their voices rising like a storm. Children clap with giddy excitement, clutching their mothers' skirts as if watching a festival. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a rope sways gently in the breeze, waiting for its neck. This was not punishment by law alone. It was a weapon of power, a game for the ambitious, and a death sentence that could be signed by a whisper. And no story captures this truth more sharply than that of Hugh Despenser. He began as nothing more than a soldier, one of countless men in armor. But by cunning, ambition, and a knack for worming his way into a king's confidence, he climbed higher than most dared dream. Soon, Hugh's shadow stretched across the whole of England, its gold, its lands, its king himself. But the higher a man climbs, the more violent his fall. And Hugh's fall would be so brutal, so unforgettable, that for centuries his death would be retold not as gossip, but as a warning. It was the winter of 1316. The royal palace stirred awake under a pale morning sky. Inside its stone belly, servants hurried through corridors, their footsteps echoing against cold flagstones. Torches sputtered as they were snuffed out. Great wooden doors groaned open for the day. King Edward II, restless and easily swayed, had decided he needed a new chamberlain. The title sounds harmless now. A desk job, perhaps. But in those days, chamberlain was no mere servant. It was the key to the king's mind and his heart. The chamberlain decided what the king saw, what he heard, and whom he met. If a letter displeased him, into the fire. If a meeting felt unnecessary, gone before it began. If a visitor happened to be a man Hugh disliked, that man's shadow would never even touch the king's chamber doors. Now the position belonged to Hugh Despenser, and in that moment, he knew. This was the chance of a lifetime. The game is in my hands now. The palace, still half asleep, whispered with quiet power. Stone walls loomed tall, lit only by the trembling glow of dying torches. The air smelled faintly of charred wood. Hugh, cloaked in heavy velvet, moved through the corridor like a shadow given flesh. Guards bowed low as he passed, not out of respect, but recognition. Here was the man without whom the king would not even stir from his bed. In the king's chamber, the fire crackled softly. The bed was still occupied, the monarch lost in slumber. But on the desk, a mountain of sealed letters waited. Hugh sat, fingers moving with deliberate care as he slit open each envelope. His eyes scanned each line, weighing words like gold dust. Useful? Show it to the king. Dangerous? Burn it. From an enemy? He'll never know it was sent. A handful of letters met the flames, curling and blackening, until nothing remained but the bitter scent of burning parchment. Hugh didn't just handle correspondence. He was shaping the kingdom's very reality, deciding which truths lived and which died. By midday, the palace gates were crowded. Merchants, lords, petitioners, some who had journeyed for weeks, stood in the cold, waiting for an audience. But it wasn't the king who decided who entered that day. It wasn't the king at all. It was Hugh Despenser. If you were Hugh Despenser's friend, the palace doors swung wide for you. Your name was whispered to the guards, and you were ushered straight into the king's presence as though you belonged there. But if you had ever crossed him, even with a careless glance, even with silence when he wanted your praise. You could wait outside those gates for months. You could send letters, send gifts, send prayers, and still die without ever setting eyes on the king again. Historians would later write, Hugh's memory for revenge was extraordinary. He never forgot an insult, even if it was 10 years old. In the evenings, the great council of the realm gathered. By tradition, this was the place where England's most powerful lords, bishops, and knights came together to shape the kingdom's destiny. But by 1320, these meetings were no longer councils. They were choruses, and every voice sang the same name, Hugh Despenser. Opponents were not debated with. They were destroyed. Some were expelled in disgrace. Others found themselves behind cold iron bars, charged with crimes that had never happened, on evidence that had never existed. A chronicler of the time put it plainly. It was not the king's council. It was the echo of Despenser. By 1322, Hugh and his father controlled nearly 40% of the king's entire revenue, enough to buy castles like baubles, or to raise a private army that could rival the king's own. And if you wanted anything from Edward II, a grant of land, a royal pardon, even a token of favor, you first had to agree to Hugh's share. The joke spreading through taverns and market stalls was a bitter one. Edward is the King of England, but Hugh Despenser is England's ruler. It was at this height of his power that Hugh set his sights on his most dangerous target yet. Not a rival lord, not a rebellious knight, but the Queen herself. Queen Isabella of France had been England's queen for 16 years. A woman of beauty and intelligence, skilled in diplomacy, mother to the king's heirs, and a vital link in the fragile alliance between England and France. But to Hugh Despenser, none of that mattered. In his eyes, Isabella was a threat, and threats were meant to be broken. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, piece by piece, until they could no longer stand. Like a spider, Hugh spun his web, and when the time came, he pulled the strands tight. It was September 1324, a cold morning heavy with mist. Across England, royal officers rode in silence. They arrived one by one at the gates of all 28 of the Queen's estates. Each officer carried the same short order. In the name of the security of the realm, this land is now the property of the king. Imagine it. A loyal steward answering the gate to find armed riders in royal colors. The clink of chainmail, the stamp of hooves on wet earth. The captain's voice, flat and final, reading from the parchment. No room for argument, no space for mercy. In a single day, Isabella's income, £20,000 a year, was gone. Enough to buy a small country or raise an army that could terrify one. She recorded the humiliation in her own account books. I am treated worse than a merchant's wife. At least she would have her own dowry. But Hugh wasn't done. The Queen's French attendants, her friends, her doctor, her children's tutor, vanished in the space of a week. 31 people stripped from her household, expelled or arrested without trial. A London chronicler captured the scene. The Queen wept openly in court, but no one dared to comfort her. The fear of Despenser's wrath sealed every tongue. Then came the cruelest cut. Hugh took her 8-year-old son, Prince John, and placed him under the care of his own wife, Eleanor. Her 6-year-old daughter, Princess Eleanor, was sent away to Wales, to one of Hugh's estates. The Queen could see her children only once a month, and even then, under the watchful eyes of Hugh's people. A mother who had kissed her children's foreheads every night now had to beg permission to hold a little hand, only to have it pulled away moments later. And still, Hugh pressed on. In 1325, Isabella was sent to negotiate peace with Scotland. But before she left, Hugh stripped away her military escort. Sending her north was like pushing someone into a forest full of wolves and telling them to make their own way out. On the journey, she came within hours of falling into Scottish hands. Only the quick thinking of local monks, who hid her in their monastery until danger passed, saved her from capture. When word reached Hugh, he only laughed. "If the Scots had done their job," he said, "one problem would have been solved." The Royal Christmas Feast, 1324. The great hall glowed with candlelight. Golden chandeliers swayed gently above long trestle tables, their light glinting on silver platters piled high with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and steaming pies. Minstrels played softly from the gallery, their notes weaving through the air like threads of silk. The scent of spiced wine mingled with the warmth of the hearth fires. Every year, the Queen sat at the King's side at the central table, the place of honor visible to all, a symbol of unity and power. But not this year. When the guests entered, they saw Isabella of France seated not beside her husband, but far below, among the lesser courtiers. Her crown still gleamed, her gown still shimmered with jewels, but the insult was unmistakable. Foreign ambassadors exchanged discreet glances, leaning toward each other with whispers. "Is this the Queen of England? Or just another guest?" None dared to voice the question aloud. All knew the truth. Challenging Hugh Despenser was the surest way to invite ruin. A queen's authority rested on three pillars: her lands, her loyal household, and access to her children. Hugh had toppled each one, and he had done it with the perfect disguise, not by breaking the law, but by twisting it, hiding behind royal seals and official decrees. Now, Isabella was stripped of her income, her allies, and the comfort of her children's arms. She was alone, powerless, humiliated. But beyond the palace walls, Hugh's enemies were quietly gathering. Soon, their patience would end. What Hugh did not see as he enjoyed his place of dominance beside the king was that this very moment, this public shaming, came after a dramatic twist of fate. Just 3 years earlier, in 1321, a powerful alliance had forced the king to send Hugh and his father into exile. Most men in such a position would have vanished into quiet exile, retreating to a fortress in some corner of Europe, playing at politics from afar, waiting for the right wind to bring them home. But Hugh Despenser was not most men. Even in exile, his hunger for control and revenge burned too fiercely for him to sit idle. If he could not rule on land, he would claim the sea. He acquired a swift ship, gathered a band of fiercely loyal men, and became a pirate. Though not the kind who struck at random. This was personal. "You threw me out?" he thought. "Then I will rob you in broad daylight." Within weeks, Hugh's black-sailed ships appeared like ghosts from the fog along England's eastern coast. This was not just piracy. It was revenge at sea. At dawn, while harbor workers still tightened ropes and stacked cargo, dark shapes loomed on the horizon. Some thought it was a trading fleet, until the first arrows hissed through the mist. Hugh's men swarmed ashore, stripping ships laden with wool, wine, and silver. They were gone before the alarm could reach the town walls. The take from that single raid? £60,000, the annual budget of a small kingdom. But Hugh was no impulsive marauder. He knew when a ship would sail, what treasure it carried, and whether its owner had once spoken against him. Years at court had given him the most dangerous weapon of all: information. These were not mere acts of piracy. They were acts of vengeance. When raiding ships no longer thrilled him, Hugh struck directly at ports. In November 1321, he descended on the port of Sandwich, setting warehouses ablaze. But curiously, only those belonging to merchants who had crossed him. It was as if a thief broke into your home and touched nothing except the drawer where you hid your secrets. Growing bolder, he captured 2 Genoese merchant ships. The news reached Italy like a slap across the face. France joined the protest, accusing England of sheltering a pirate who attacked the ships of her allies. More than 300 men, knights without land, hardened sailors, and criminals, joined his fleet. On the Channel Islands, Hugh built bases to divide loot and forge safe passage papers for a price. You might think King Edward II would have stopped him, but the king turned a blind eye, or perhaps both eyes, because Hugh's loot helped finance his return to power. After only months at sea, Hugh discovered a truth he would carry back to land. Theft done with the sword could be profitable, but theft done with the law could be endless. The king summoned him back. Hugh returned to court as chamberlain, not as the cautious servant of years past, but as a man hardened by the wind and salt of the Channel, a man rich with plunder, cunning, and the taste of unchecked power. Sitting before the king, he declared, "The law is mine, and the weak will always bow before the strong." Edward laughed, for now that strength served his throne. Over the next 4 years, Hugh seized more land than many noble houses had gathered over centuries. His weapon was not the sword, but the quill. Paper, seals, and accusations became his armies. If Hugh wanted a property, he could simply claim it belonged to his ancestors, and the courts would hand it to him. Lady Barrett of Leicester, a wealthy widow, owned 3 fine estates. Hugh accused her of plotting against the king, a charge so vague it could mean anything, even questioning a tax. One cold morning, soldiers battered down her gates, dragged her to the Tower of London, and left her to the mercy of its dungeons. After 3 weeks of hard questioning, which meant chains, darkness, and the rack, she signed over all she owned to Hugh. 6 months later, she was dead. Hugh walked free on her lands. When the Earl of Gloucester died without an heir, the estates were to be shared among his 3 sisters. One of them, Hugh's wife, Eleanor. But Hugh forged documents declaring the other sisters in debt to the crown. Their shares were seized in the king's name and handed to him. When one sister protested, her husband was thrown in prison. She too surrendered her claim, her silence bought with fear. Hugh did not merely take property, he took dignity. He took the will to resist. Between 1322 and 1326, Hugh Despenser swallowed up 41 castles and lordships across Wales and the borderlands. Not a single sword was drawn, not a drop of blood spilled. His weapons were subtler, accusations whispered in the right ears, imprisonment without trial, and forged papers that bore the king's seal. An entire swath of territory, larger than some duchies, now bowed to him alone. Petitioners never even reached the courts, because the courts themselves were Hugh's. Judges owed him loyalty, scribes copied his forgeries, and witnesses could be summoned for the right price. Those who resisted simply vanished, their absence explained away with a shrug, or their bones quietly rotting in some forgotten dungeon. Hugh's greed was boundless. When the estates of the nobility were not enough, he turned his gaze toward the wealth of the church. That was his mistake. The church was not merely a landowner. It was the soul of the realm. To strip it of property was to invite its wrath, and its wrath was holy, public, and deadly. The most powerful weapon the church could wield was not a sword, but an accusation. And in medieval England, the deadliest accusation of all was sodomy. It was more than a sin. It was treason of the flesh, a crime against both God and king, punishable by death. And not a clean death, but one meant to shame for eternity. Rumors began to spread. Hugh was accused of being too close to King Edward II. Far too close. Chroniclers whispered, "They are always together, speaking in private chambers, rarely apart." Priests and rival lords muttered, "The king has abandoned his wife's bed for Hugh's company." Whether truth or political poison, historians still debate. But it didn't matter. The stain of the accusation was enough to quicken Hugh's fall. November 24th, 1326. Hereford. A 3-story wooden scaffold loomed above the market square, built high so that no eye could miss the spectacle. Thousands came from miles around. Food stalls lined the square. Musicians played slow, mocking tunes. This was not simply an execution. It was a festival. In the royal box, Queen Isabella sat with a cup of wine, her face calm, her eyes bright with satisfaction. She had been waiting for this day for years. In the crowd, voices murmured to one another, "Come, let's see the end of Despenser today." Hugh was brought out naked, shaven from head to toe, the winter air biting at his skin. Across his body, words were scrawled in ink and pig's blood. On his forehead, Judas. On his back, sodomite. A crown of thorny grass was jammed onto his head, the barbs pricking and swelling his skin. He was tied upside down to a horse and dragged through the streets, the route chosen to pass through the neighborhoods whose lands he had stolen. Rotten vegetables and scraps of meat struck his body as the crowd jeered. Children laughed. Men spat. At the scaffold, he was hanged, but only for 40 breaths before the rope was cut. A bucket of vinegar was thrown over him to keep him conscious. The goal was not to kill him quickly. It was to make him linger. With a heated blade, the executioner inflicted a mutilation meant to strip him of both dignity and hope. The act carried out before his eyes. The crowd roared. Next, his belly was slit open. The executioner drew out his entrails and cast them into the fire, while Hugh, still alive, watched the smoke rise. Each charge against him, land theft, corrupting the king, sodomy, piracy, was read aloud. After each, a new torment was inflicted. 4 hours passed before the beheading. It took 3 heavy blows of the axe to sever his head. Then came the quartering. His head was set in an iron cage atop London Bridge. One arm sent to York, the other to Bristol, one leg to Hereford, the other to Northampton. In each city, the remains hung in public view, a warning to all who would follow his path. 4 years later, on November 29, 1330, the wheel of fortune turned again. Those who had orchestrated Hugh's fall met their own ruin. Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella's lover and partner in Hugh's destruction, was hanged at Tyburn. Edward III, now king in his own right, did not kill his mother, but he locked her away for 28 years. And in a twist of irony, he ordered that every year on November 24th, prayers be said at Hereford for the soul of Hugh Despenser. In the end, Hugh's story left 2 bitter truths. First, the abuse of power always ends in ruin. Second, the game of revenge never ends. For the executioner of today may be the prisoner of tomorrow.